Good evening, everyone. Okay, that you were here last week, so those of you that actually vocalized, but we're going to do better. Good evening. Good evening. All right, thank you. Welcome to tonight's class of race in the United States. I'm Michelle DePass. I'm part of the amazing team that is co-designing this course. Maya Wiley, Derek Hamilton, I'm in awe of them, and we will proceed. We have an amazing lecture for you tonight, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome Deva Woodley and Shanelle Matthews to deepen our understanding of how race plays out in our society, in our communities, and in our public policy. And tonight we're going to get to talk about, we'll start talking about how race has persisted and been incredibly ugly in the ways that it has played out in the streets with the police brutality and the killings of Black men, spurring the rallying cry and a movement, Black Lives Matter. But it does not stop there. The movement has transcended our culture in ways that no other movement has for decades. And Deva and Shanelle are going to take us through this tonight. I want to ask how many of you have recently even read, aside from the readings of tonight, have read anything in the recent newspaper articles about Black Lives Matter? Raise your hand aside from what you were supposed to read tonight. Okay, now that's maybe about a third of the class, right? It actually should be everybody. And part of the reason is because the media is not covering all of the nuances, the touches, the excitement, the strategy of the Black Lives Matter movement. And Deva and Shanelle are tonight going to take us through that, to engage us in that. And we are really very fortunate to have their expertise here. So I want to welcome our live stream audience as well and remind you that we are using hashtag race in the US. And also remind you that next week, our class, if you would like to join us, is not Monday night, it's actually Wednesday night, and it's called Fraught Crossroads. It's a tongue twister. And the lecturer will be Lawrence Weschler, who will be taking us through a lecture on art and race. So it's Wednesday, October 11th. And for those of you that join us here on campus, it's in this room as well, UL 104. So let me take you through the biographies of our esteemed panelists. Deva Woodley is an assistant professor of politics at the New School, a former fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study. She is the author of The Politics of Common Sense: How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance. Her research covers a variety of topics from democratic theory to political behavior and social movements. In each case, she focuses on the impacts of political discourse, on public understandings of social problems, and how those common understandings impact democratic practice and public policy. Her current book projects are Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements, an examination of ways that social movements repoliticize public life in times of political despair, and what we talk about when we talk about the economy, a broad investigation of American economic discourse and its implications for politics and policy in the post-Great Recession era. Welcome, Deva. Shanelle Matthews. Shanelle is an award-winning political communication strategist with a decade of experience in journalism, legislative, litigation, rapid response, and campaign communications. She serves as the Director of Communications for the Black Lives Matter Global Network, which organizes to end state-sanctioned violence against Black people by building power and winning immediate improvements in our lives. She previously served as a Deputy Communications Director for the Sierra Club, where she led communication strategies for their flagship campaign, Beyond Coal. Before that, she worked as a strategist for the ACLU of Northern California on reproductive freedom and LGBTQ rights. In 2016, Shanelle developed Channel Black, an immersive training program that prepares the next generation of Black millennial spokespeople to make critical, real-time interventions on racism in the United States through the media. She is also the founder of the Radical Communications Network, an online and offline community of people who are committed to taking a radical approach to winning by working within social change and public interest communications. And most importantly for us, Shanelle is our first activist in residence at the New School. So she is one of us. So I'm going to turn it over to Deva for the first hour of our conversation, and I'll join them for a Q&A. Deva.
Hello, wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting us. Oh, is this not on? Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me now? And Shanelle and I are actually going to do this as more of a collaborative work in keeping with the movement for Black Lives and the way that folks do things in the movement. We are each of us going to be sort of contributing our expertise to giving you a picture of what the movement for Black Lives is now and what it is today. My work is on social movements, so I will be giving you the history and context of social movements and also a little bit of expertise on political behavior and public opinion as we go through. And Shanelle will be giving specific examples of how the movement does the work that it does and also her particular expertise in communications. So shall we begin? Mm-hmm. First, I guess I should tell you a little bit about how Shanelle came to be here with us, which I am more than thrilled about. I can't even tell you. It's because I sort of wandered into this book project. When I say I wandered into it, that makes it sound more casual than it was. I was inflamed in the summer of 2015 and throughout the year of 2016 by the movement for Black Lives. I was just captivated by what was happening in terms of the organization of the movement, in terms of people who were involved in the movement, and then, of course, by the trauma of the killing of Black people, women, men, and trans people, that was being filmed in the streets of America. And it seemed like a new video was coming out, every week for a while there. So as a social movement scholar, I felt like I needed to address the movement for Black Lives. And I especially felt that I wanted to address the movement for Black Lives because everything that I was reading about it in kind of journalism were kind of hot takes of the moment. And I wanted to put it in context. And I wanted to actually talk to the people who were working in the movement and figure out the place of the movement for Black Lives in the history of social movement activism in terms of its organizational structure, its organizational culture, its techniques, its preferred action repertoires. These were the things that I just wasn't seeing, and I wanted to find out. So the first person that I had the incredible fortune of talking to was Shanelle. She was my first interview in the Movement for Black Lives, and speaking to her was a revelation. And I realized that it was a revelation because everything that I had suspected about the sophistication of the movement, about the thoughtfulness of the movement, about the political analysis and critique of the movement was revealed to be true in our conversation. And also the big thinking of the movement was revealed in that moment. And I thought, what a wonder it would be to have her insights with us at the New School. And how could this happen? And so I did a little research and came up with this idea of activists in residence, took it to our supportive, my supportive dean at NSSR and our supportive board members, and we were able to bring Shanelle here to do some public programs and share her knowledge and do research of her own regarding the movement for Black Lives and the Black liberation movement as it stands today.
Thanks, Deva, and thank you, Michelle. This warm welcome is so kind. Our work is really feels very boring most days. So thank you all for having me. I'm thrilled to be here at the new school, and I'm incredibly grateful for Deva's commitment to making this position a reality, and also Dean Milberg and our Board of Governors and Maya, and Fred Dust and Suzanne Foote, who helped to make this position a reality through their support, their funding. I am just so thrilled to be able to have this partnership, because in a lot of our spaces in the movement where we have to be highly reactive to what's happening in the day-to-day, and it creates a bit of a microcosm in our spaces, and we're just going back and forth. And so the expansiveness that happens at places like the New School, the space for thought, is, I'm really incredibly grateful for that and plan on taking full advantage of it while I'm here, while also hoping to impart some of what I know, which is just a little bit, onto the students and the faculty and staff, and also the broader New York community, which I'm sure makes the new school amazing as well. I do want to start by saying I'm sitting here in front of you, but what makes a movement is a number of people working at rapid rates with each other, struggling in both conflict and happiness, will fulfill what you see that comes through on your TV screens, which, by the way, is incredibly reductive. So I'm going to give you some more insight into what it is that we do. But there are people who work full-time jobs, aging parents, have children that they care for, are volunteers elsewhere, but they find time for this. And in my experience, that's the only way that we are going to realize what, in our movement spaces we call freedom. However you define that for yourself, you have to figure out how to realize that too. But it's going to take all of us, certainly, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how you all can get involved. 10 years ago, I was here in New York as I just finished journalism school.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that better? Awesome. 10 years ago, I was here in New York as an extern at Women's E-News, writing on the maternal mortality and morbidity of Black women. And it was there in that newsroom that I realized I could not sit idly by while my colleagues were preaching about objectivity. As a Black queer woman, I did an alchemy on myself and realized that that wasn't possible for me. And it wasn't the way that I wanted to talk about the social issues that I cared about. It felt highly ineffective and erasing in a lot of ways. So when I left the newsroom, I started to work on public interest communications, and therein I realized a lot of contradictions with our social justice work lived. The same people who were advocating for voting rights for Black people in the South were also saying that they didn't want Black people to live in their neighborhoods. There was an inherent, what felt to me like both a bias that we all carry, but also willful ignorance around checking our own selves in dealing with this work. And so going into public interest communications for me was about winning the story. And if anybody here has ever worked on communications, particularly in a rapid response setting, you just have a little bit of time. The people from the neighborhoods that I grew up in, where we come from, what people believe about us is typically predicated on stories that are told about us long before we're born. So I am uniquely positioned and also aware of how harmful those narratives are and how they creep up in every facet of our life, and that we have to detect them when they do, really reflect on where they come from, and also reject them. Is really one of the only ways for us to get rid of the kinds of biases that lead to the reasons why the movement for Black lives and Black Lives Matter exist right now. Next slide, please. So before we go into kind of the minutia of it, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Black Lives Matter Global Network. My assumption is that there's a conflation, I know that there's a conflation of the hashtag Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter Global Network, which is an organization, and also the broader movement moniker that exists, that I'm sure many of you have discussed either at your Thanksgiving tables or with your favorite uncles. But Black Lives Matter Global Network is an organization with staff. I'll tell you about them in a minute. What most of you all know is hashtag Black Lives Matter was fermented in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman. In that moment, Alicia Garza is one of the founders, along with Patrice Concolors and Opal Tometi, started working together to realize what would later become an organization of 40 chapters and 8 staff members, and a movement moniker that has reached internationally. And after George Zimmerman's acquittal, if you'll remember, in August of 2014, Michael Brown was murdered by Darren Wilson. Many people, not just the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, but people from all over the country went to Ferguson in support of the organizers on the ground, and then later went home and decided that they were going to organize in their local communities to bring justice at home. Because it has to, I think, in many ways, the media does a disservice to the movement because the nuance can't be there. So it doesn't necessarily talk about the leadership of 3 Black queer women, or 2 Black queer women, excuse me, and what that means for this movement moment. If you know historically, and Deva can give us some analysis of how movements have been structured and how male leadership is often romanticized in a way that reduces the experience and leadership of other people, but doesn't bring to the forefront the many nuances and identities that exist within movements. We are centering, it is a political strategy, but also about making sure that we're all seen, centering the lives of Black transgender women, of queer people, of gender nonconforming people, in a world that doesn't make a lot of space for us. And those things are critical, and we know that we are telling people these stories over and over again. And if you do any communications work, you know you have to say something a dozen or more times for people to really get it or to break through the noise. But it's incredibly important to know that the ideas that are coming out of these movements are born of people who are living at the intersections of multiple identities. And those identities are often disregarded or dismissed in ways that are incredibly pernicious to not just our lives, but also to the lives of the people that we're working to serve. Next slide. This is the BLM staff. I wanted to show their pictures because folks don't know that we have a staff. We work remotely, but we're very lucky to have this group of incredible experts who are most of them are organizers. Prentice at the top does our healing justice work, is a healing justice director, a therapist, and I'll go into kind of the capacities that the movement holds. But it feels important for you all to know that it's not the direct action that you see on TV, that is a well-oiled machine of systems that happens behind the scenes that nobody ever gets to see. Miski Noor works with BLM Minneapolis, an organizer, and also our communication strategist. Rihanna Anthony, who's our Southern Regional organizer from BLM Nashville. Candace Montgomery, I'm saying their names because their names should be said. Candace Montgomery, an organizer with BLM Minneapolis, also our Midwestern regional organizer. Rodney DeVerlis is our brand new lead Canadian organizer, so we organize across borders. Whitney Washington works with our Nashville chapter. She's our operations person. God bless ops people and people who love to do that work. Nikita Mitchell's our director of organizing and works with BLM Bay Area. And finally, I serve as director of communications. In addition to that, next slide, please. We have 40 chapters across the world, 35 here and 5 abroad. And the job of the staff is to really add capacity to what the chapters are doing. So our organizing theory is around local organizing. How many people in here know what community organizing is or understand it? So quite a few. We strongly believe that only at the local level can you really make enough significant change for us to all come together more broadly. People talk a lot about national narratives, and I think that's such an interesting way to discuss frames because the only way that we have a national narrative is by the states coming together and people working in collaboration with each other. I was working, when I was in college, I started organizing largely at LSU around, we had a Confederate flag on campus that they flew in the football stadiums, and people can't believe it. This is 2003 to 2007. I often actually get people who say to me, I don't believe you. It happens more often than you think. But organizing around the eradication of the Confederate flag on our campus. Also, we were dealing with significant reduction in tenured positions for women, for LGBTQ folks on campus, non-ADA compliance. And so for me, approaching communications comes from an organizing perspective. And a lot of what I do, in fact, too much of what I do, is spending 30% of my time organizing media decision makers to diversify and democratize their talent. Because only when we diversify and democratize our talent and not see a white male monolithic perspective in the news media will we be able to make the best decisions for ourselves. We can't do that with the information that we've been given, which is not enough. And if we're talking about realizing a true democracy in this country, I think that that's going to be critical to that. Our chapters vary in size from a few members to tens of members. We often provide support, capacity support in the areas of legal, communications, healing justice. And I do want to say a bit about the healing justice piece. It's so integral for us to be transformed, as Mary Hooks from Southerners on New Ground would say, transformed in the service of the work. Because only through our own healing and recognizing our own biases and our own pitfalls and how we exist in the world, I think can we actually develop a prophetic vision for how we want to see the world. And I certainly have been transformed in this. And I was talking to AJ, who does communications for NSSR, for the article that came out today, and I was realizing how much personal transformation I've had to go through to be in this position, what is required of me in terms of realizing that I can't transcend the ability to be a good organizer or a good communicator, that every single day, my lot in life is to work on significantly reducing my own bias, my own phobias that I have, that I perpetuate these systems. And I think in a lot of ways, so many people have felt shamed and embarrassed about acknowledging that, about saying out loud, I have this funky thing that I don't like, or I feel a certain way about a particular demographic of people, but I'm too embarrassed to say it. And there is nowhere to go to say those things. There's no safe space out there where we don't create space for people to deal with a lot of their phobias and whatnot. So anyway, healing justice is at the center of our work, in part because we have to recognize, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, that only through that self-transformation and recognizing our own pitfalls can we teach other people about what's possible.
Yeah. Okay, so there's so much to say. In terms of just the context for all of this, because I want everybody to understand how original and important the way that the movement for Black Lives is structured. So Shanelle, again, and I just want to emphasize this, is with the Black Lives Matter Global Network, but there are a lot of organizations that are involved in the movement for Black Lives, right? 50 plus organizations have endorsed the public policy platform, something else that you may not know about, right? Which is a 5-pronged platform that is published online and translated into, I think, 6 different languages, right? A very detailed and intricate policy platform that the movement, right, not only Shanelle's organization, but all kinds of organizations in the movement wrote and put together and published in 2016. So let me just say this in terms of the importance of the organizational structure of the networked nature of the movement, is that ever since the late 1990s, any of you who have had sort of like a social movements 101 may be familiar with the term new social movements, right? It was a term for movements that were starting in the sort of 1990s, not hierarchical, right? That were sort of horizontally organized, that had a kind of looser network structure, that would have, like, for example, ACT UP, right, in the LGBT movement would have like caucuses and affinity groups, right, that were kind of loosely organized under a larger moniker with a larger belief system. So the movement for Black Lives follows in that tradition, but has sort of refined that tradition to a level where the networked structure is a lot more muscular than it used to be, right? So the network structure allowed movements to avoid a lot of the problems that would come from hierarchy, right? So people feeling like they were silenced, something that Kathy Cohen, a political scientist at the University of Chicago, calls secondary marginalization, which is this phenomena where even within movements, the more marginalized people tend to be the people who are silenced, right? So we have seen these conversations happen within, for example, the women's movement, right, where women of color would say, well, look, like, these sort of concerns are not really my leading concerns, right? The leading concerns are the concerns of more affluent white women, right? This would also happen in the LGBTQ movement, where lesbians would say, but, you know, these are not necessarily my leading concerns, right? The leading concerns that we are talking about are about affluent gay men, right? Gay white men, usually. So secondary marginalization is something that is often reproduced in movements, despite their best efforts sometimes, right? One of the things that promotes that is hierarchy. So the sort of more horizontal network structure was one of the ways that people were addressing that, but it's also harder to get things done. Right? It's really hard to get things done if you don't have a hierarchical leadership structure. But the Movement for Black Lives has started to address that problem with the tight communications focus that they have. So that, and this is partly enabled by technology, right? Is that you don't have to necessarily be in the same place with people or even be in the same organization with people in order to talk with them, right? So in walks Skype, in walks Google Chat, right? In walks a bunch of different ways that you can feel like you're in the room with people that you're not actually in the room with, right? Beyond that, you have a very refined, what I think is an ideology. Now, I've interviewed a lot of people in the movement since that first fateful interview with Shanelle. What I have found is that people don't consider themselves to be kind of designing an ideology, but from the sort of remove of scholarship, I really think that they are. And you can kind of see it in the capacities, right, in the tables that you will take us through, right, the healing justice table, the communications table, and also in the emphasis on centering women and especially LGBTQ folks in the movement. And here are some of the tenets to what they have sort of put into the world that the world has, by the way, been very hungry for, right? Things like self-care. You know, self-care? You remember how 5 years ago nobody said self-care? Yeah. Everybody says self-care now because of the Movement for Black Lives, right? And it is, and you can do that. You can do your own like Google Trends search, right, and see the uptick, right, of self-care in late 2014, 15, right, in people not only sort of searching for it, but using it, right? It's all over online now, and now it's like written about everywhere, right? And it's combined with wellness and all sorts of things that are not necessarily the original kind of sort of spiritual meaning of self-care, but are instead more in reference to mani-pedis, but which is fine.
Still need those.
Like we need those. But this whole idea comes out of this healing justice framework, right? That's really central to the movement. Now, why is the healing justice framework central to the movement? Because the idea of trauma is taken very seriously in the movement, right? So the killing of Black people by vigilantes and agents of the state is not just a matter of civil rights being violated. It is that, but it's also a trauma, right? It is traumatic. And dealing with that trauma, right, is a part of getting to justice, right? What justice could be, right? Additionally, this tendency to, in the movement, interrogate our own biases, right? Interrogate all the ways that we aren't right, okay? Interrogate all the ways that we have privilege, right? You know, in different aspects of our lives. That's also a part of this idea of healing justice, right? And is also a part of healing yourself from trauma, right? Okay, this all relates to an idea that was actually popularized by bell hooks, right, in the 1970s. And this is a kind of margin to center way of doing politics, right? And that means that in many of our ideas of justice, right, we think about, at least in the 20th century, if you think of like sort of the great sort of democratic theorists that you may have read in your political science courses, is that what they do is they come up with a set of abstract principles, right? And they say, if we can fit the world to these principles and we can have the right procedures to execute these principles, then we'll have justice, right? But there's another way of thinking about justice. And bell hooks wrote in the 1970s that the way that we need to, and not only bell hooks, right? We could also think of those of you who are deep into political philosophy, think about Enrique Dussel, right? Who's a Brazilian philosopher, who talked about the periphery. And basically the idea is the same, is that if you want to think about justice, you have to look at the people who are the most vulnerable, who are the most impacted, right? Who are the most oppressed, who carry the weight of the most in this world, and think about how to get justice for them, and that will teach you how to get justice for others, okay? And people in the movement for Black Lives really believe this. This is part of the reason that they center Black trans people, for example, right? It's the opposite of what we might think of as respectability politics, right? Which is another phrase that was popularized by the movement, even though it was authored by Evelyn Jane Higginbotham, right? It's the opposite of that, right? Because in the movement, they always say, look, having a good reputation, dressing the right way, having the right degree, that won't protect you, right? And we see the evidence of that every day. Okay? So the movement says we don't have to worry about being the model whatever, right? The model minority, the model Black African American, the model woman, right? Because being that model, we tried that. and it turns out it won't save your life. Okay? So instead, the movement says what we need to do is to look to the margins, look to the people who never get lifted up, and lift those people up and design policy around thinking about what would make their lives thriving existences, lives free of oppression, lives that were able to be self-determined. Okay?
And so the way that we're doing that right now, just to be a little bit more specific, so as Deva mentioned, there's a difference between Black Lives Matter Global Network as an organization and the broader Movement for Black Lives, which is the umbrella coalition of organizations and individuals who are committed to winning improvements in the lives of Black people and eliminating state-sanctioned violence. And when we say state-sanctioned violence, we're not just talking about officer-involved shootings of Black people. We're talking about the water of Flint, Michigan residents being poisoned, and we're talking about slow response rates or no response rates to hurricane victims, Black and low-income hurricane victims. We're talking about lack of access to quality food or prenatal care. These are all ways in which the state impairs our ability to thrive by either reducing services or stigmatizing people in a particular kind of way. So the Movement for Black Lives, it exists, many organizations, we have a table structure. And so when we talk about kind of the sophistication of the movement, that gets lost in the reporting of it, but also in like the kind of rumors and the far-fetched concepts around who we are and how we exist, are these well-oiled machines that we're building right now. And we don't ever purport to transcend how to do this well. We are experimenting. We like to believe that we test things and figure out what works and have conversations and really invest in conflict resolution with each other. We don't have the luxury of avoiding that. And I will just say, in movements that I've been in before, avoidance of conflict is a par for the course, and it just creates so much resentment and tension that I can't really see how we would move past that to realize anything for people that we're serving. Again, back to healing justice and healing our own trauma is being able to say, I disagree with you, and have dignity in that experience. So the tables, so Movement for Black Lives is a policy table, an organizing a direct action table, communications, electoral justice, healing justice strategy, and resource. And we did that because we really want people to organize from the place of their strengths. And so we all find a place for ourselves. And I chair the communications table with Chelsea Fuller from Blackbird and Mervyn Marcano, both brilliant communication strategists. I'm honored to work with them every single day. But part of what we were really wanting to do is move out of what would be considered kind of a hegemonic way of organizing. Most of us consider ourselves organizers, and the capacities in which we organize are all different. I happen to specialize in communications, and that works for me. The next slide, please. One more. Yeah. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the the things that we have worked on or are working on right now that give you a little bit of insight into what it is that we're doing. So the first are direct action, organizing and direct action table. Really, organizing is the bread and butter of the movement. It's the place from where we operate. Everything else supports that in a lot of ways, but really building political power for people who have otherwise not had it. And so we can pass legislation, but if we don't shift the culture and build power for people, legislation is just going to continue to either not be enforced or be written over time and time again. So we're really committed to direct action. BYP 100, BLM, Asada's Daughters, organizing in Chicago, led a campaign around direct action to oust the attorney general who was there, the state's attorney, Anita Alvarez. It's really important to know that we have our eye on legislators who are not doing their job, who are governing poorly, or who are stigmatizing entire communities to win campaigns. And those folks aren't going to win easily if we're around. So this is one campaign that organizers ran to showcase that we knew that Anita Alvarez was targeting and persecuting Black youth. Intentionally. And we wanted to raise that and say, your job as state's attorney is not to put more Black youth in cages. And so they led a direct action campaign supported by local organizers to ensure that she was not reelected to office. Another way that we're working is through the Channel Black program, which I founded, as Michelle mentioned, last year to really close a deficit among people who are considered experts on print, television, radio. We had in our movement several people who did feel confident having those conversations, but many more who didn't. And programs to train folks like this are really exclusive and very expensive and hard to access. So if we're committed to democratizing the voices and faces of people seen on television who are opining on important issues that impact Black communities, we have to provide them with the skills and arm them with all the tools that they need to do that effectively. And I'll go through that a little bit later because Steve and I are going to jump into the communication strategies of the movement, which is where I live. Another place is the fundraising. And so as you can imagine, we have to resource our work. There's an incredible amount of anti-Black bias in funding. It is incredibly hard. I mean, we have to petition in ways for funding that other people do not. And it can be an incredibly demoralizing and disparaging experience. We're grateful to have funders who do support our work unequivocally, and some funders who redact anything about Black power in the funding narrative. But it's important to know that exists because in that ecosystem of resourcing, we are required to contend with other folks in movement spaces for that money. And so we did, for Mother's Day this year, something called the Mama's Day Bailout, where we bailed out over 100 Black mothers who were in prison for nonviolent offenses, who had small bail amounts, $200, $300, and couldn't get home to see their kids. And this happens all over the country all the time, where people are kept or kidnapped away from their families and held at ransom for $200 or $300. It's a way that the system does impact the abilities for families to thrive and for parents to be home for their children. That continues to move through the work of an organization called Southerners on New Ground, which you should all know about. Incredibly groundbreaking in Atlanta. It's been around for more than 20 years, who are doing really rigorous organizing around LGBTQ issues at the intersections of race. Another, as Deva mentioned, is the policy platform. So last July, our policy table, led by Tenjiwe McHarris and a handful of other people, developed a really comprehensive policy platform that gives our direction and instruction for how to improve the lives of Black people in this country. It touches on everything from education to healthcare. You can find the Vision for Black Lives, I think, at V4BL. But if you look up Vision for Black Lives policy platform, it should come up. I strongly encourage you to read it, and if you're teaching, to encourage your students to read it. It's incredibly smart. Another is Law for Black Lives. So this is some work that I feel so proud of, watching co-directors Christina Francois and Marbury Stolley Butts really pull together legal professionals who are committed to serving the movement in a particular kind of way. I do want to read their mission statement. Law for Black Lives is a Black femme-led national network of over 3,000 progressive lawyers committed to building a responsive legal infrastructure for movement organizations and cultivating a community of legal advocates trained in movement lawyering. This, to me, is so critically important. And for anybody in here who studies law or practices the law, of course, you know all of its pitfalls, but the people who fall through the cracks when the law is interpreted in a particular kind of way are folks who look like us and have been for a very long time. It was not set up, as you all can imagine, to serve and protect us in that way. In fact, you know, the policing system, the modern policing system came from people who were capturing enslaved slaves. So it's something to think about when you think about the structures, the legal structures, the policing structures in this country, how they're set up. And when you hear people say we should abolish the police, you should take that very seriously, because it's not just a flippant cry for us to not have any structure around safety and security. It is a recognizing that the existing structures, both legal and policing structures in this country, were intended and created to keep people enslaved. For folks who have forgotten. And then, yeah, the electoral justice table, which is brand new. So Jessica Bird, who runs 3 Point Strategies, an outstanding electoral strategist who's promoting and supporting the election of Black women across the country, and fingers crossed, we will have our first Black woman governor, Stacey Abrams, out of Georgia. Is working right now to develop a political identity for the movement. So critically important. And as you all know, it's really important for us to win the state houses next year. We have 439 open congressional seats. Everybody should get involved in GOTV efforts. This is important because the votes of many people in this country are suppressed. And so we need to both run Black people for office, movement folks. There are a handful of Black Lives Matter organizers running for city council in their local cities, which is awesome. But we also need to develop a localized electoral strategy so that everybody can get involved. Participatory budgeting, supporting your friends who are organizers who understand the plight of communities, who will service the communities in ways that some people who are governing are not doing anymore. And then lastly is healing justice. And I mentioned this to you guys, but I can't stress enough the importance of Prentice, our healing justice director, Harriet's Apothecary, who's a local healing collective that comes in and supports people with somatics work. They do Reiki, they provide, therapy, talk therapy. And this is the kind of stuff when Deva says we talk about our trauma, we use it, we have trauma-informed ways of moving through the world so that we're mindful, not to bring on or perpetuate existing triggers for people who are working in the movement, but also to, again, be aware of our own need and desire to heal in order to do this work effectively. You feel me? Okay. Yeah. And then, let's move on.
Okay. So, but that's one of the other things that it's important to understand is that part of the focus on trauma and this work and on healing is something that people learn from elders, right, in other movements. Because, we have had many movements, right, or we did have in the 20th century, and even so far in the 21st century, it's been a movement-rich period. And one of the things that people who work in movement spaces will tell you is that it is hard and grueling and personally taxing work. And so one of the things that movement folks learned, right, many of whom have been involved in other movements or other kinds of causes for justice, right, so like reproductive justice or people who worked for the ACLU or the UN, what they learned was we have to deal with this in our movement spaces, right? But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about democracy, because the work that the movement is doing now in electoral spaces is something that's really important to understand, and it's critical to the movement, but also it's critical to movements in general. And I say that as a scholar of social movements, right? And it's a big difference. So for example, and it's difficult, right? Because many people who are radical and work in movement spaces are very distrustful of electoral politics for many good reasons, right? But one of the things the Movement for Black Lives is doing is that it's not about endorsing or supporting candidates that are existing. It's about new people running and new people getting involved, right? It's about people who are very informed and have strong political opinions, thinking about themselves as candidates for office, right? In this way, it is a part of a trend that we have seen across many movements, I would say, since the 2016 cycle and the inauguration of 45. That matters, right? That means something, because it's not only people in the Movement for Black Lives space who are thinking about what does it look like for different kinds of people to be running for local especially, but also other levels of office, right? What does it mean for people who are not sort of born and bred and raised, right, to the, national politics, right, to political families, et cetera, to get involved in their city councils, to become aldermen, to be on the school boards, to demand the democratization of various kinds of local governance. So, for example, Patrice Colors in California works on getting citizen review boards for police departments, right? And after she gets the review boards, getting those review boards the authority to do things like recommend indictment or termination of police officers, right? And to help people get better data on police contact with citizens. By the way, we have terrible data on police contacts with citizens. As a social scientist, I have to say it's one of the most horrific and sort of purposeful, sort of black holes in terms of research, right? Is that we actually don't know very much. Our data is very poor in that area. So getting citizen control over that kind of thing is really important for the work that we can then build and do. And that's part of what the Movement for Black Lives is doing, but also what movements are doing in this context now. And it's very critical moving forward. What else did I want to say? I wanted to say about okay, so the other thing I wanted to say was a more general point about what social movements do in democracy, right? Which I think that we often forget. We often think of social movements as, like the Movement for Black Lives, some specific form of redress. And even in thinking about them as a specific form of redress, we reduce them, right? So if you talk to most people about the Movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter, they think, oh, that's about police brutality, right? But as Shanelle has been telling us, it is an enormously complicated and nuanced movement that's really about thriving, right? Black people thriving, and about the end of oppression and domination, right? The end of oppression and domination for Black people, but also for people, right? Because that's the whole margin to center ethic, right? Is that you start from the people who are the most impacted because that's the only way you get to where you think you're going in terms of justice, right? All right, so social movements are actually much more complicated than we think of them as. And they're actually not interruptions in the democratic process, right? They're not a sort of a disruption, right? That means something has gone wrong. But instead, what I argue is that social movements are actually a democratic institution. Since the beginning of the modern nation state, right? And certainly democratic nation states, we have had social movements. We have had social movements in democracies because social movements are necessary for democracies to continue. Okay? Electoral politics can only do so much, right? And electoral politics can only do so much because when we are as we are, right, in a representative republic, we are choosing candidates. We are choosing candidates that have authored issues, right, or have been told about issues. And it's a sort of menu that we have in front of us, right? And because all large organizations tend toward stagnation, bureaucracy, non-responsiveness, after a while, the menu becomes stale. Okay? There may be some comfort for some people in going to a restaurant that they've been going to for 20 years and having the same things on the menu. But most of us have a little bit of a palate change. And when we're talking about justice, obviously, it's an even more critical need, right? To have change, to have the things that we are deciding between actually be things that are going to impact our life, that are going to impact our ability to determine our lives, right? Our ability to have self-determination and our ability to not be oppressed, okay? So what social movements do is that they shake everything up. They rewrite the menu. They give us new candidates, they give us new issues, and they make us consider the system anew as well. It also reminds us that democracies, right, even democratic republics like this one, are really about the power of the people. Okay? And if we are to have the power, right, as the American founders said that we were, to author a more perfect union, that means people getting in the streets and demanding that we have the power to do that, right? The power doesn't only reside in our elected officials. We authorize them. And social movements are the time when people remember that. Now, this is critical because part of the sort of apathy and cynicism and disengagement that we have witnessed from people from the electoral system is actually because the electoral system is less responsive, right? We are dealing with a responsiveness problem, okay? But it also makes people disengage, which causes a kind of vicious cycle. It becomes less and less representative because people are hearing less and less, right, from people who are not already involved. What social movements do is wake people up to the fact that they are members of the polity, that they have power, that they have responsibility, that they can imagine a different way of doing things and can be a part of implementing that new way. And the movement for Black Lives has been critical in doing this, right, for Black people, but I think also across the political spectrum. The movement is not the first social movement of the 21st century. The first one was actually the Tea Party, and the second, Occupy. But the movement for Black Lives has had an incredible cultural impact, right, that we haven't seen from these other movements, okay? And when I say a cultural impact, I mean in terms of the diffusion of some of the discourse we talked about, in talking and thinking about intersectionality, in talking and thinking about self-care, in talking and thinking about holding space and making space, in thinking about checking in, right? All of these terms are movement words, movement concepts that have diffused, right, into general usage. Not only that, but talking about racism again, right? Not diversity, racism, okay? Is something that the movement has done. So this movement, I think, because of its incredible nuance, right, and cultural productivity, in addition to its political and policy and electoral productivity, and I should say, you didn't say enough about the Buy Anita campaign. I went to graduate school in Chicago, and that's the city I claim. And Anita Alvarez presided over the whole cover-up of Laquan McDonald's murder. Yes, she's that one. By the Chicago Police Department. Also tried to hush up the zone, I forgot the name of the zone where they were disappearing criminals or people who had been convicted of crimes on the west side of Chicago, like an exceedingly corrupt district attorney who had just been there kind of riding the machine for years. And so these movement groups got together, and again, it was a collaboration among several organizations, and organized this Buy Anita campaign. And guess what? Anita said, bye-bye. Right? And she's not the only one. This has particularly been very successful in ousting DAs, right, across the country. So, for example, in Florida, this has happened. This has happened in many sort of towns and districts in the South, is that Movement for Black Lives groups, right, affiliated groups, have been successful at actually changing local government. And we usually don't hear about it because it's local government, right? It's not national government. They didn't endorse anybody who was running for national office, right? So they have no political platform. No, it's that they start with the local, because it's actually local politics that impacts the lives of people much more immediately, right? So if you have a new DA, that makes a difference in how the bail system is going to be executed in your town. It makes a difference in which streets are going to be patrolled, how they're going to be patrolled. It makes a difference in how people are going to be charged and sentenced, or whether they will be. It makes a difference in whether there'll be treatment programs for addiction, or people will just be thrown in jail. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So the movement has a very sophisticated political vision that's being enacted, but we don't hear about it because it's different than what we're used to. It's different than the narrative we're told about the great movements of the mid-20th century. But this is the new century, and they're doing things in a new way. And the impact, the full impact, I think, is yet to come.
Next slide. Speaking of narratives, I want to tell you all a little bit about kind of in this, we don't have much time left before we do our Q&A, but a little bit about a project that we're currently working on. I mentioned it earlier, Channel Black. So Deva beautifully laid out all of the things that we're up against and what we're trying to do. And one of the areas in which I work is around narrative strategy, or winning the story. So in a moment, and oftentimes our work is reduced into these flashpoints. Something happens and then we react. But we're also constantly working on deconstructing long-standing and harmful narratives that impact our ability to earn, to thrive, or just to live. So Channel Black is a training program that prepares this generation and the next generation's Black millennial leaders to move our agenda through the media, a progressive agenda, one that moves people from the margins to the center. So last year, in joining BLM, we were hoping to train up a cohort of progressive change agents who could do this exact work. They're not pundits. That would be reductive to us. We are no Gore Vidal or William F. Buckley. We are committed, like Baldwin was, I think, in many ways, to creating an intervention in real time. So what does it look like to see somebody on television who looks like you, or to read something from somebody who comes from the neighborhood that you come from, who knows exactly how to talk about those issues, but it's not filtered through a white male monolithic perspective, but instead is given the nuance and the creativity that it deserves? Does that change the way that we understand each other? Does it change the way that we understand the world? How will we know if we don't experiment with those kinds of things? So based on my personal experience over the last decade as a journalist, as a movement communicator, as an organizer, there were a couple of areas that I saw. My hypothesis was that if we developed a methodology that included these areas, we would be able to train up folks and democratize talent, but also push media makers to think critically about what their outlets would look like if they had more nuanced voices. So we work in this area. So, and I just want to also say narratives and frames and the way that people understand other people, the way that people understand Blackness, so critically important to this work. One place where that came up for me was my time at the ACLU. I was working on reversing a piece of legislation called the Maximum Family Grant. I don't know if they have that here in New York State, but it basically says that if you are receiving cash assistance from the state and you have one family member another family member cannot. And so it's really disincentivizing poor women from having children is at the end of that. It's eugenics in a kind of way. I was traveling the northern part of the state, talking to to people who had given up their children because they couldn't afford to keep them. But even my colleagues who had understood that their frame was that if you can't afford to have a child, then you should not. It didn't take into consideration the labor market, the fact that most of us, and it's intentionally created this way, cannot earn at the same level in this country, and that we have social services for a reason. And when they were benefiting white women in the 1950s, they were totally fine. But when more Black women or other people of color started benefiting from services, they became incredibly stigmatized. And I saw these kind of contradictions of narrative happening in real time in my work. So my colleagues, at work would be working on eradicating terrible legislation and simultaneously saying that they didn't feel like poor women deserved to have children. And I was becoming increasingly frustrated, I think, with the neoliberal way that we were moving within these larger organizational structures, and particularly around the stories that we told about people and our lack of curiosity or being generative about how we understand individuals and how we move through the world, particularly Black people. I mean, I find in my work, so few people are curious. They're very emphatic about what they think they know about Black people, the way that we experience the world in this country, the way that legislation impacts us, the way that culture shift impacts us, but very few people ever ask us any questions. And by us, I mean the communication staff at BLM. I get a lot of statements. I get a lot of decisive, really crazy stuff, you all. I should share some of this stuff with you guys. A lot of finger wagging, a lot of paternalism. And so narrative felt to me also because for a third of my life, I lived in South Central Los Angeles, where the assumption about somebody like me was that I would live a particular kind of life, however that looked. It was decided before I even got a chance to determine my own fate. And being in the newsroom, hearing people tell stories that I felt needed more space, needed more nuance, needed more air to breathe, or we needed to offer new information. And that is, to me, one of the, and I don't want to call it a burden, but it's a challenge of the progressive cohort right now, is offering new information to people and trying to find space in what is, we have a lot of information coming at us. But more than that, we are all confirmed by the people around us that what we believe is probably right. So it's really bumping up against kind of the psychological, sociological phenomenons that we're in our bubbles, and it's hard for us to have those meaningful conversations. So anyway, getting new narratives about people can be challenging. If the media is not doing it, if the people you're around believe what you believe, where do we find the space to learn that new information and to get uncomfortable with the fact that we're probably wrong about people? And in comes for us Channel Black, and so we train this group of people of progressive and radical, really, organizers to move our agenda through the media through 5 areas, including debate, cognitive science, improvisation, media spokespersonship, and political strategy. And we run kind of a well-oiled machine where each of these folks get to coach, and they meet with their coach every week, and we pitch them, and we develop the messaging and the narratives, and we're deciding what intervention do we want to make today. And I don't want to sound flippant about it. It's not that we go and do one radio show and we make a huge intervention. It's that we do this over time, over the next 50 years. It's our job to give people the language and the ideas for them to explore for themselves how to realize a true democracy. We can't expect people to show up at the ballot and vote in the best interest of Black people, which all of you should be doing. Voting for Black people is voting for yourself. If we don't give them the information to be able to make those decisions. And as you all know, the media in this country is owned by a very select few people who happen to also be the wealthiest. So it's incredibly complicated. But we are based on my own personal experiences as a Black queer woman, I've come to understand our obligation to move narratives, to deconstruct old harmful narratives, to build new ones and offer people this information as a moral and ethical responsibility. And I've committed myself to doing that, and also plan on doing that in concert with Deva and folks here at the New School, so that we can continue to commit to the New School's values and mission of making sure that everybody has equal access and representation. And then obviously, you've seen it show up many a time in the news media, and maybe you don't recognize it, but
you can see it show up today.
Yes, it took 12 hours for them to show a picture of the Las Vegas shooter, which is not true for, even last year in July, they showed a picture of a Black man who was not, during the Dallas police shooting, who was not a suspect. But he had, yeah, exactly.
Well, also with the stuff today, immediately, whose picture did we see?
Yeah.
Whose picture? That's actually yeah, the girlfriend, right? Who's the Asian woman? Her picture was everywhere. We didn't see this dude, right?
And when when you saw the murder of Tamir Rice, 12-year-old, that child was somehow, he was placed on trial for his own murder after he was murdered by police officers. Of Mike Brown, even the New York Times said, he's no angel. And so the reporting and the narratives that we're seeing, and I don't need to tell you all this, you see it, but I do think it deserves more space and more conversation. And I think we are running low on time.
We're out of time, and we want to talk to you guys. So,
but you're not done.
No.
Are we not done?
We have question and answer.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
We want to talk to you. That's how we want to talk to you. Yes.
Okay,
Hello?
great. So thank you. No, I know everybody wants to applaud for you right now, but talk about an incredible narrative for us. But we have 22 minutes to be able to go into a question and answer session. And so, well, I think we are done with the slides. So I want to open it up to ask both Shanelle and Deva some questions, whatever is on your mind. And let's see.
Doing something?
There we go. Okay, so you can take this one and let them have that. And let's open it up.
Thank you so much. That was an incredibly informative and invigorating presentation. I wanted to ask if you can speak a little bit, actually for both of you, about the global aspect. You mentioned working in 5 countries.
Maybe a little bit. Okay, we're still means to be a global network. That's something. The question is, can you talk about the global aspect? And I can speak to it from a Black Lives Matter Global Network perspective. We obviously just hired a lead Canadian organizer. We have chapters in Vancouver, Toronto. We have a coalition that works together in the United Kingdom. And then informal chapters that work in Paris and Ghana. And for us, because most of us, all of us on this team, on our team, except for one, were born here, we have been socialized to understand our fight as fairly local, as domestic in a lot of ways. And we aren't given the tools oftentimes in most spaces to understand the intersectionality of international, but we are committed to. So UK, our members run campaigns in environmental justice, similar campaigns that we run against police brutality and violence. We're hoping to expand that we can understand what a global democratic vision for our work looks like. Any suggestions we take? We take that. We're still figuring that, and we're still comrades. Johannesburg. I mean, everywhere you can imagine where Black people are organizing.
Just really quickly, that's the other thing about this movement, is that the logic of it, its ideology, the margin to center thing, makes you look out, right? It makes you look elsewhere, because when you are looking at your own sort of understanding of the world, your own biases, your own privileges, and what justice means if you are really organizing for the least of these, then it makes you have to consider new places, right? Being in touch with new people who have different kinds of knowledge about what it means to be free.
Hi, thanks for being here tonight. Was very insightful. And I was wondering, this is more a question in terms of organization. Because I was wondering, I was thinking of the presidential elections, because you were also talking about the electoral part of the BLM. And I myself was a secretary at my hometown university of my student association, and I always tried to, together with my team, to promote as much as we could to get people to cast their vote and attend different sorts of events. And I was wondering, because you were saying social movements are here to remind people of who they are and that they can take action, actually. So I was really wondering what your viewpoints are, and how to tackle the fact that some people are just do not show to cast their vote, or do not show to listen, or people stay home, and how do you tackle?
What have I done, right? Trying to get people to be invested in this. What have we missed in terms of motivating people here in this moment, right? Because that's what it is. It's about, whatever moment, right, whatever political stage that you want people to be at, there's really sort of prior work that has to be done, right? Are we talking about the things that people care about? Are we talking about it in a way that people understand? Are the people here representing people in a way that they feel like they can believe in, right? Those are questions that have to be asked before you have the moment of the ballot box. Because that moment is a decision moment, but it's not really a culminating moment, right? That is a procedural moment in democracy, a necessary one, but the work of democracy takes place all before that, right? You know what I mean? It's sort of like opening night at the theater or something, right? Like, you can't just have that night without all the work that went into it, right?
It's also about, another way of saying that is organizing people the place of their insecurity. Conversations that people in government are having don't relate to a mother of four who's working a part-time job one place and a part-time job in another place. Like, the conversations we're having are fairly esoteric, and we can be very navel gazing. It just gets a little bit embarrassing when you think about, like, when's the last time you talked to somebody who was working in fast food or in retail? When's the last time you had a conversation? Fight for 15 is an amazing example of this. I think they're doing a great job of centering the voices of people who were working to serve by having them as spokespeople for the campaign. Another way to look at this is Podemos, which is the third largest political party in Spain, is a great model for some folks to look at how you organize people at where they're insecure. So this particular group of professors saw that there was some economic instability and austerity happening in Spain, and they created a political communications tool to galvanize people around what they were feeling. So they were like, these folks are over here talking about stuff that doesn't make sense to you. We're going to give you the information that you need right here. And we know that the system, at least the two-party system in this country, or the system that we have politically, doesn't have space for that kind of intervention. But I think that we have an opportunity to people don't pressed. I also believe people become to different parts of their life and step away from that same politicization when it's feeling like maybe too much or burdensome. I don't want to shame or guilt people back into the communities that taught them how to be either racist or transphobic or something like that. But we want to encourage them to exercise their democratic right in this country in the best way that works for them and their families. And having voting during the day on a Tuesday isn't the way to do that.
So thank you. That was amazing, and will continue to be amazing as you both continue to work here at the New School and beyond. I want to ask a question about the because the self-care issue is so important, particularly because trauma is so real and it really does get in the way of the work. But you also have to move in rapid time. Which has always been one of the challenges of doing self-care and dealing with trauma, but also having to sometimes move on a dime. So can you just talk a little bit, Shanelle, about how that works?
Ooh, does it work? That's an excellent question. We are, in our movement spaces, we have to hold each other accountable to this. We internalize the same kind of keeping things moving, tethering our productivity to our value that other institutions do. And we have to try really hard to remind ourselves that we are not the sum of our work here. We are whole in spite of what we do. We are valuable in spite of what we do. And, there isn't a person I know in leadership in this movement who's not overworked or exhausted or needs, like many of you, I'm sure, needs more self-care. It's just our country doesn't socialize people to taking care of ourselves or each other. And in fact, I've had to learn to be just incredibly more tender and graceful in spaces because you never know what somebody's going through. And also, I'm watching these folks bend over backwards and work their fingers to the bones to make incremental change that is going to have a big impact over time, but it's really hard to see it right now. And so, for me, personally, I have to commit to actually scheduling my self-care. It has to go in my calendar, because if it doesn't go in my calendar, it's not going to happen. And for a while, I felt embarrassed about that, but I'm letting that go. I don't want to be embarrassed about that. I just want to know that, if I'm going to go to the gym or if I'm going to meal prep for myself or something like that, it's got to be in my calendar just like everything else. But also, I look to the people in our movements who hold this work to remind me of that. We've got Bold Black Organizing and Leadership and Dignity, which is a leadership program for Black organizers that teaches us about the importance of somatics. What does it mean to actually be able to rest your face and your eyes? How much tension do you hold behind your eyes? How much tension do you hold in your back? How can you, there's so many days where I feel like I'm just jittery because I'm constantly on go. Anybody else feel that way? It's just constantly going. What does it mean to expel all of my breath out of my body and center myself? Even now, just to say, like, I'm gonna relax into my body and just not be on all the time. And so it's incredibly challenging. I don't want to pretend that I have it down to us. I don't. And I work on it every single day. And I expect the people in my life to say to me, you need to get it together so that you can be here for a very long time, because that is a really insidious way that Black people are dying.
Okay. No.
Just really quickly, again, just in terms of the logic of the movement, I want to say that when I realized that the movement for Black Lives was polling better than either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, and really, not by much. We'll take it. not by much, but still more popular than either one of them. And in the summer of 2016. Was like something really weird is going on right now. But I think it's because of this commitment to the diffusion of all these discourses is a kind of turn away from the neoliberal common sense that we've had, since the sort of late 20th century. What you produce, you must be efficient. You must be rational. You must be self-interested, right? And instead thinking about things like solidarity, intersectionality, connection, healing, self-care. All of these things are, whether or not you're really down for the liberation of Black people, really interesting to modern people and modern life, because it's something that we're all missing. And so I think that's really critical in terms of also what the movement brings to the table.
Okay, so I'll begin with a disclaimer. I am someone who's very optimistic, but my question is a little dark and ominous. So I read a lot into the Black Lives Matter and let's say the Panther parties, right? I've read all their books. So one of my concerns with you guys, and I know that with the Black Lives Matter, it's a faceless movement, right? As in there isn't a leader, like there was a Huey or a Bobby.
It's not faceless. We just are decentralized.
Well, okay.
Plenty of faces. I'm one right here.
Okay. Right. Nope. Right. That's what I'm saying. So, as having said that, how do you guys feel about the international component? Because, for example, I'll use Malcolm X. When he went to the Mecca, I felt like it placed him on the map because now he was tying how the injustices that he's faced in the U.S. as a Black man also resonated in. What country was that? Yeah. So then, because he was over there, the government became even more intimidated and threatened by his presence because I felt like he linked the international component. So do you guys feel at all threatened about the Black Lives Matter being an international movement rather than just one that's domesticated? And two, are you guys afraid at all that there may be a COINTELPRO 2.0?
There is definitely, yeah. Yeah, all the time. I'm glad you asked about this, and I think it has, for me at the very least, and this may not be true for other people, I can just speak from my perspective, it has less to do with it being international. I mean, we went to Brazil this year to organize with people in Sao Paulo and Bahia around police violence. We are going to join organize with more folks. That's happening across borders no matter what. And we don't organize thinking about all the with fear. We're concerned. We're rigorous. We are vigilant when it comes to minding our security protocols. But we are acutely aware that we are being surveilled. We have members who are getting emails right now from the government asking for their emails for the last year, and we have to, and so we have to arm ourselves with legal protection. We have to arm. There is a man here in New York City in Harlem named Matthew Mitchell who helps us with digital security and organizing, and really helps broader movement people understand why do we have to have two-factor authentication. It's so annoying, but you have to do it. Why do we use apps that encrypt our language and our messages? They are watching us. They are probably watching right now. And that they are watching right now is supposed to sound really weird and curious. That's what the intention is around creating suspicion around surveillance, so that I sound unhinged and what they're doing is completely normal and under the radar. But spying on Americans is as American as America, but it's not normal by any stretch of the imagination. And I shouldn't have to do all of these steps so that the government doesn't take me in for conspiring against them when I'm actually fighting for fundamental human rights for Black people. I think that in a lot of ways, so what you said in terms of us being faceless, we are not structureless, we are not faceless, we are decentralized because hoarding power causes problems. because we are trying to do things differently. But this country is deeply invested in authoritarian and male leadership. So we are also bumping up against structural problems with understanding that leadership can be one, it can be female, it can be trans, it can be queer, it can be disabled, it can be we don't see it modeled a lot in this country, but leadership can show up in a number of different ways. And that those people who are in leadership are acutely aware of what's happening in terms of surveillance and what's happening in terms of wedge narratives, right? Where it's like, some people say, well, isn't it true that, even your comment, and we should definitely discuss it more, but us being faceless is a real misnomer to what decentralized leadership looks like. And I would love to spend time talking to you and whoever else has questions about how it works. Because if you don't see it modeled, it's probably hard to believe that it's possible, but we do make decisions.
Time for, I think, 2 more questions.
So, first off, hats off. I applaud you. You all are brave. Older generations tend to look down on newer generations and be critical, but clearly the bravery that you do, I admire greatly, because my generation was apathetic. My generation seemed to be caught up in the neoliberal norms of Reagan, and if there didn't seem to be continuity in the civil rights movement, because we tried to engage in respectability politics. So I'm gonna get to my question because I know time is running short, but are there any links to the civil rights movement that you want to express, or any connections, despite what I believe to be somewhat of a disconnect that hinges on my generation?
I would love to hear Deva actually give some analysis on this, but I will give one example. So intergenerational support is happening in the movement for Black Lives. Barbara Smith, Barbara Ransby, talking about Black women, Kimberly Crenshaw, who have stepped in to support our organizing, who come to our movement spaces, who hold us like they're kids, like literally physically hold us, and who give us honest and rigorous critique about both the things that we're doing well and areas that we need to improve. So the Black feminism, what Black women do, what we bring to social movements is well and alive in our movement. We are holding on so tightly to that. I mean, I treat every single time I'm with these women as treasure that I just pocket and pull out when I need resilience. I think Black women in organizing have set a foundation for support. This self-care thing comes from our need to care for ourselves, where that care is not nurtured in other movement spaces. So, and I think in some ways, I don't know what your generation is, but oh my God, Black does not crack. I love being Black. But I do. That's the thing I'm holding on really tightly to, is the thematic through line of Black women in organizing and self-care and the ways that we support each other is a real model for everybody else.
Just in terms of analysis, what I find so interesting about the Move for Black Lives is that there really isn't this discontinuity, as she said, but instead there is a kind of, it's a retelling of the story, right? So for example, Barbara Ransby is an activist from way back, but also a historian, and she wrote the definitive book on Ella Baker, who was the unsung backbone of the American civil rights movement. So what the Movement for Black Lives has done is deliberately connect with parts of the history of the civil rights movement that have been ignored. So there is continuity, but it's a resuscitation of things that we haven't remembered, and things that we were in danger of forgetting, but the movement looks for these people.
So first of all, thank you. It is incredibly part of the reason that I was I'm gonna go to the new school is because I was oh wow, Black queer leadership, sign me up. But you talked a little bit about Harriet's Apothecary, you talked a little bit about BYP 100, and there are lots of organizations here in New York that organize with those organizations like the Audre Lorde Project and lots of other spaces that do so through a queer Black womanist lens. And those organizing tactics are rooted in transformative justice. So you talked a little bit about abolition, you talked about, what the Mama Day bailout looks like, but can you talk about the place that transformative justice has in the way that the movement for Black lives has developed here in the States, and what that might look like for, 5-10 years from now when we are looking at the movement as an international sort of driving force?
Thank you. I have a quick structural question, something that you guys just mentioned actually, about BLM being more of a horizontal organization versus a vertical one, less hierarchy, but the reality is many organizations are still very rely on hierarchy. The organization that I work for, the New York City Department of Education, is a perfect example. So my question is, how do you first of all, do you believe that the type of ethos that you're talking about can be absorbed into organizations like the DOE or any other bureaucracy? And if you do, how?
Okay, great question.
So just the first question, I am not an expert on transformative justice, and I won't purport to be, but I can put you in touch with people who are. The place, organizing through a Black queer feminist lens is a politic created, I think, by BYP 100. They then their members teach it as a curriculum, and it's incredibly important. The part of that feels most resonant for me is around pushing back on traditional ideas of leadership in social movements. So that we have trans leadership, that we have women at the helm, that we have gender nonconforming people or gender variant folks. I mean, it's offering a new model of a way to move through the world that I think is inherently transformative in and of itself. Even if people are just seeing, even if they don't grasp the concept of it, because to me, also this thing that you're saying, it feels very mouthy for the average person. I can't tell my grandmother about organizing through a Black queer feminist lens, so I have to break down for her what that means, and that for her may mean, what it would have looked like to center Ella Baker instead of Martin Luther King, for example, right? And using those illustrative intersectional examples to show people, as opposed to telling them, what transformative justice looks like. And in a lot of ways, our movements need to do a better job of breaking that language down for everyday people so that we reach more folks, because my aunties don't get it. To your question, I don't know, actually. I think that's an excellent question. I would love to grapple with it. I would love to run some experiments if you're interested. But I think part of the... Just experiment. Maybe not. Yeah. I think it's an excellent question to ask, and we are not necessarily flat. We have hierarchy. I don't want to pretend that we don't. We have staff who get paid. We have volunteers who don't get paid. We have a management team on our staff. We make decisions that other people are not involved in or privy to. So we are not hierarchy-less. We are just committed to leadership that is shared across people, irrespective of their age, their position, their socioeconomic status, their sexual orientation. And so we're modeling what we'd like to see, and I think you should do that too.
If I could point you to a program that's at Milano called the Institute for Transformative Mentorship, which is a program on transformative justice, you can actually engage and learn more about transformative justice. So we're really proud that we're engaging in that. So that is it. Now, can we have a round of applause for our amazing lecturers, Shanelle Matthews and Deva Woodley?